Hello, and in this session we're going to be looking at the prophet Jeremiah. Quite a long book, and of all the prophets, he's probably the one that gives us a greater insight into his own personal emotions, because he's a very emotional man, and he reveals in different parts of the book how he's feeling. He writes down exactly as he's feeling. And so of all the Hebrew prophets, he's probably the one that we have a closer insight into actually how he was thinking. Now, in Jeremiah 36, we are given the reason why the book is not in chronological order. So as you read through the book, you'll see that different prophecies occur at different times, and you can tell this because of the kings that are mentioned, but they're not chronologically arranged. And the reason for that is that his prophecies had to be rewritten. We'll come to that. So he prophesied approximately from 626 BC through to 586 BC. And 586 BC is a very important date in the Old Testament because that is the year that Jerusalem was overthrown and the exile of the Jews took place to Babylon. So Jeremiah then was living at a time when the nation was running headlong towards destruction and exile. And he prophesied over and over again what would befall Judah if they failed to turn back to God. And unfortunately for him, he lived to see his own prophecies fulfilled. And so he lived to see that destruction. And he's often referred to as the weeping prophet because he expresses his tears and the depth of his emotion over what he could see was coming and what eventually did come. So Jeremiah chapter 9 and verse 1, for example, is where he mentions that, "Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people." And that's one of a number of passages. He was a very lonely man, and his message was constantly being rejected. And again, in one of his heartfelt expressions, Jeremiah 20 verses 14 to 18, he actually said, "I wish I had never been born." So that was the extent of the pressure, emotional state of Jeremiah at the task that he had, this long ministry of declaring to the people, but constantly being rejected. Life was in danger on occasions. He was treated very badly by the people. And so on that occasion, he said, "Oh, I wish I'd never even been born." So he was born into a priestly family, which we can determine from the first verse of the first chapter, and so he was, so it says he was one of the priests. So he would no doubt have been born for the priesthood because that was his lineage. And so clearly he would have been brought up in a religious home in that kind of environment. But he was called to be a prophet. So God called him into the prophetic office. And we know he was young because he tells us in chapter 1. So he's probably a teenager when he was called. And he was given a commission not only to speak to Judah, the kingdom of Judah, but also to the nations. So Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 4. Very as a well-known and well-quoted verse, very interesting verse about God's knowledge of each individual. So verse 4 says, "The word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I anointed you as a prophet to the nations." And then Jeremiah says, Lord, I don't know how to speak. I'm only a child." So we know he's very young. But those verses also tell us that God knows each individual before we're born, and he has a plan and purpose for each of our lives. So for Jeremiah, he was not to pursue the priesthood, but he was to pursue being a prophet. So we learn that he was from the town of Anathoth, which is in the tribal territory of Benjamin, just next door to Jerusalem and Judea. And this was a town back in Solomon's day when Solomon had exiled Abiathar, the priest, who was a descendant of Eli, which means that Jeremiah himself then may well have been a descendant of the priest Eli. And this is interesting because in 1 Samuel 2:31, God put a curse on the line of Eli because of Eli's behavior in not reigning in his wicked sons. And the curse was that no members of that family, that lineage, would live to an old age. So this would no doubt then, if this was the case, would explain why God called Jeremiah so young, because he would not live to an old age. He would have a ministry of 40 years or so, but that would still only bring him into his 50s when he died. Jeremiah 16 verse 2, we learn that he was a bachelor, and in that chapter God said, "You are not to marry." So this is why one of the reasons for his loneliness, God instructed him he was not to marry. But the reason why God said that was because the distress that was coming on the nation was so great that he didn't want Jeremiah's heartache to be increased by the concerns for a wife and children living in those terrible times which would end in exile. So Jeremiah suffered a great deal for bringing the prophetic word. But he remained faithful to God right up to the overthrow of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And after the fall of Jerusalem, he wasn't taken into exile because Nebuchadnezzar knew that he was prophesying that the nation of Judah should have submitted to Nebuchadnezzar. But he was forced against his will by some of the remaining people in Judah who were left behind, forced to go to Jerusalem. He told them, "Don't go to Jerusalem. That's not God's will. You should stay here." But they forced him to go there. And the Bible doesn't record his death, but tradition says that he was stoned to death in Egypt. So God called him then to call the people back to repentance, reveal their sin, reveal their unfaithfulness. So this is the job of the prophets of the Old Testament. Remember, the nation of Israel, north and south, were under a covenant relationship with God from Mount Sinai through Moses, where they had covenanted to obey God. And remember, the conditions of the covenant were very simple. Obey me and I'll bless you as a nation. Disobey me and I will withdraw my blessing and you'll be overrun by your enemies and exiled if you continue to do so. So that's what Jeremiah was doing, constantly reminding them, come back to the covenant, obey God. But they refused to do so. And when the judgment came, it was a demonstration that God was faithful to his covenant. But all through Jeremiah's prophecies, as with the other prophets who brought the same message in different ways, God would bring the people back one day and bless the nation once again. But in the meantime, they had to go through this terrible ordeal as a result of their unfaithfulness. So Jeremiah prophesied during the reigns of a number of kings of Judah. Remember, Israel, the northern nations, northern tribes had already been exiled to Assyria. Now it was the turn of the southern tribe of Judah. So the kings that he was prophesying through, first of all, was Josiah. Now Josiah was a very good king. one of the last of the very good kings. And he was only 8 when he came to the throne, because his father, the previous king, had been assassinated. So 2 Kings 21, 24, and 2 Chronicles 33, 25 tells us the story. And as Josiah was growing up, he was very zealous for the Lord. So it was during Josiah's reign that they discovered rediscovered the book of the law, as it's described, which is probably the book of Deuteronomy, which contains all the covenant regulations. And when they realized how far from God they'd fallen, Josiah was desperate to try and restore things back to the nation. And so there took place a program of reform under Josiah. So that was at the beginning. Right? So Josiah was the king when Jeremiah was called to prophetic office in Josiah's 13th year. So Josiah would have been 21 at that time, around 626 BC. And then 5 years later, he commenced this great initiative of reform. But unfortunately, Josiah was tragically killed in battle at the age of 39, 2 Kings 23, 29 to 20. And with the death of Josiah, greatly lamented by the people, that was basically the end of the reforms. And so the next king was Jehoahaz, who came to the throne about 608 BC. So this is just not long before the beginning of the first of the 3 exiles. But he only lasted 3 months because he was deposed by the Pharaoh of Egypt, who appointed Jehoahaz's brother to the throne. So Jeremiah lamented the deposing of Jehoahaz and his subsequent exile to Egypt, Jeremiah 22, 10 to 12. So Jeremiah no doubt saw great potential in this king, but Jehoiakim was appointed in his place, 607 to 597 BC. Now, those dates will be, no doubt you'll notice that they're significant, because it was at this time that the first wave of the three-wave exile began. That's when Daniel and his friends were taken into exile. So he reigned for 11 years, but he was a bitter foe of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah suffered under his reign. And so to begin with, Judah was a vassal state of Egypt, and then subsequently of Babylon, when Babylon came down and took over. So it was a terrible backward step for the nation that Jeremiah had been encouraged in his early ministry, but now things were taking a backward step. So the next king, Jehoiachin, 597, was a puppet king of Babylon. So Babylon had come and had taken over. Jehoiachin only lasted for 3 months and 10 days, but his reign is described as being evil. So he was reaping what his father had sown, and he was continuing that. So he was only 18 then when he capitulated to King Nebuchadnezzar, and was carried into Babylon as the next wave, or in the wave that took the aristocracy to Babylon. And he was in prison for 36 years there. And so Nebuchadnezzar appointed Zedekiah as the king. And this was the last king of Judah then, who reigned from 597 through to 586 when then the destruction came. And so he was 24 when he came to the throne, and he was a weak, vacillating monarch. He promised to obey Nebuchadnezzar, what they would do, they make a covenant to do so, so to become a vassal state, paying tribute. But he reneged on it, and that brought the wrath of King Nebuchadnezzar to Jerusalem, and the subsequent destruction of Jerusalem. So he treated Jeremiah badly as well. So those were the kings then that into the run-up of the destruction of Jerusalem that Jeremiah was prophesying under. So just looking at the man himself, Jeremiah, we can see that he was torn between two things. He had great concern for his nation, but he had passion for God. And so he was torn between these two things because God was saying, I have to fulfill the covenant and punish them for their sin. And Jeremiah understood that. But of course, he did not want to see his nation destroyed. And so he's always torn between these two things. So some see him as an advanced picture of Jesus in that way. He was a man of endurance. So his starting very young, as we saw, he had a 40-year ministry, 40 years or so. And you can see his passion and his love coming out. Love for God, love for the people, distress at the sin and what's coming. But he saw no outward response to his preaching, other than in the early days with Josiah. But beyond that, the kings would not listen, the priests would not listen, and the false prophets were there to hound him and prophesy the opposite of what he was saying, which of course the people were very happy to listen to. They didn't want to listen to Jeremiah. But he was a man of great faithfulness. He had a very severe message to deliver, but he carried on delivering it time after time, as we've seen with great tears. So he was able to keep going because he had this conviction, God's called me to do this, I must do it. And also he had confidence in God for the nation. He knew God was saying, I will restore the nation because that's what I promised in the Old Covenant. So he had confidence in God's purposes, but he also had a great prayer life as well. So all these things helped him to continue in this very, very hard and lonely and difficult ministry. So as he was getting towards the end of his reign and the destruction was coming, what he was prophesying was to the people of Judah was to submit to King Nebuchadnezzar. Don't resist him. Submit to King Nebuchadnezzar, because Jeremiah knew that God was using, first of all, the Assyrians for the northern tribes of Israel, and then secondly, Babylon for the southern kingdom of Judah. God was using these Gentile and pagan kings to discipline the nation of Israel initially, and then Judah now. And Jeremiah knew that if they submitted to the discipline of God by being under the yoke of King Nebuchadnezzar, God would not destroy the temple. But they refused and refused and refused. So Zedekiah ended up being surrounded by the Babylonian armies in Jerusalem. And unlike Hezekiah years earlier, who was a good king and sought God, God did not come through to rescue them. So Zedekiah lived to see the destruction of his city and of his nation. We turn to the book itself. We read in accordance with the customs of the day, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well, that scribes would write down the prophecies. So the Apostle Paul used scribes. And so Jeremiah's scribe was a man called Baruch, who was a very faithful man. So Jeremiah 36, I referred to earlier, King Jehoiakim burnt the first scroll. Well, remember that the book Jeremiah would have written on a scroll, as they did in the Old Testament days. And as it was being read to him, King Jehoiakim, with a penknife, cut off the bit that had been read and threw it into the fire. And so eventually he burnt all the scroll of Jeremiah's prophecies. And so God said, Jeremiah, rewrite it. You'll have to write all the prophecies I've given you once more. So that's no doubt the reason why the book is not chronologically arranged. Perhaps Jeremiah wrote them as they came to his remembrance. Things to notice about the book, 5 things we could note. First of all, regarding the nation of Judah. Apart from Josiah, we can see that the kings were bad kings. So there's a refrain that runs through kings in the Bible that gives the name and said, he did evil in the sight of God. That's a common refrain. So this was the midnight hour for the nation of Judah, and Jeremiah was the man that God had chosen to be his spokesman at this time. So that was the nation. And international, right at the very beginning, God had called Jeremiah to prophesy to the nations as well, not just Judah, but to other nations. And we'll look at those as we go on. So Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 10 to 18, God gave that to him as part of his commission. So he was witnessing very great international powers that were at work. But in the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, we can see that God's hand is upon these international powers. God raises them up and God casts them down. And also around Judah was a series of smaller nations that Jeremiah prophesied to as well. Some of the prophecies were very detailed and fulfilled in detail. Looking at the spiritual side of things, Jeremiah made clear in his prophecies that the prosperity of the nation would depend upon how the nation lived. Righteousness, justice, morality in daily living depended on following God's ways. And God said to the nation through Jeremiah 2 verse 13, they, that's the nation, the people, they have abandoned me. So that was how God revealed his situation, his feelings towards the nation. And then the personal aspect of Jeremiah's prophecy is again revealing that following the Lord very much depends on our individual lives. So our heart and attitudes towards God is very important. So the word heart is used over 20 times in Jeremiah's book, and one well-known verse, Jeremiah 1 verse. One well-known verse is the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? So that's one of a number of different prophecies or expressions about the heart. And we'll look at another one, significant one, a little later. And then predictive, there are a number of predictive prophecies. Just to pick out one or two, Jeremiah 31 verse 15, compare that with Matthew chapter 2 verse 17 to 18, speaking of the sorrow that would come at the murder of infants. So Herod's killing of the infants in Bethlehem. Jeremiah 23 verse 5, compare that with Luke chapter 1 verse 32, where Jeremiah prophesied that there would be the birth of a righteous king who would come from the line of David. Jeremiah 31 verse 31, this is another one regarding the heart, a very important verse here, where he, we just turn to the to the passage where he's talking about the new covenant that would be written on the heart. So let me just read that verse now. So the time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers. So this is not like the old covenant through Moses, when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. So here comes the prophetic word. I will put my law in their minds. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. And no longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. So that is a prophetic word of the nature of the new covenant that would be coming through Jesus. So the book reveals a number of things. First of all, the corruption of the nation. So the leaders had become corrupt, so the kings, and that spread through the community. The kings became corrupt, the priests became corrupt, the prophets became corrupt, and the people became corrupt. And once that had set in to the community, then it seemed that momentum was impossible to stop. So wrong leadership leads to, or long leadership in the nation leads to revolt against God. And the second thing we can see is the divine judgment in national life. So the failure of the kings to adhere to the ways of God brought consequences to the life of the nation. I think that's true still. You know, when you look at the current state of the Western nations that were all for centuries following, in principle at least, the biblical values. So in our own nation, our laws were based on the Bible. But as we've gone further and further from God, our nation is becoming very troubled indeed. And the third thing is that true service for God is not judged in outward human success. So if we judged Jeremiah on his outward success, it wouldn't rank very high. But of course, success is not based on that kind of outcome. It's based on faithfulness to God. And Jeremiah was 100% faithful, successful in his ministry, even though no one responded. So just running through the book of Jeremiah, picking out some significant passages and significant prophecies. Chapter 1, verses 11 to 19. Jeremiah, following the call of Jeremiah, he's told of what's going to happen. So the nation's broken the covenants, and disaster will follow. So chapters 2 through to chapter 5, God is bringing his case against the nation, which he calls his sinful, unfaithful wife. So remember, the imagery through the Old Testament is that God is the husband of Israel, and she is an unfaithful wife, lusting after other gods. And in those chapters, there's a clear warning that judgment's going to come from the north. Now, the nations always came from the north because, well, apart from Egypt, which is in the south, but because that was the only way an army could come, because to the east of Israel was the vast desert area. So they would come through come following a path that's like a crescent moon and come down from the north when they were attacking Israel. Or those who were coming down to attack Egypt followed the same pathway. Now, chapter 7, verses 3 to 4, gives us an insight into what the people were thinking. They were saying, we've got the temple of the Lord. God will never cause the destruction of Jerusalem because we got, or the temple, because we got the temple of the Lord. In it we have the Ark of the Covenant. But Jeremiah was saying, don't keep thinking the temple is going to save you. It won't. We saw in Ezekiel how God's Spirit departed from the temple before the destruction. Chapters 8 to 9 of Jeremiah, the people are being deceived by false prophets. So all the time, false prophets are saying, there's no disaster coming. Everything's going to be all right. Don't worry. And so, of course, the people listened to that message rather than Jeremiah's message. But in chapter 10, Jeremiah says, the idolatry of the nation will be its downfall. And chapter 11, this was coming because the covenant had been broken. And then chapter 12 is another one of Jeremiah's heartfelt talks to God, where he says, why are the wicked prospering? Everything seems to be going all right for the wicked. I know what's going to happen, but they seem to be prospering. And God's reply is, judgment is coming. Just wait. And we see something very similar when we look at the book of Habakkuk. Chapter 13, prophets often gave practical illustrations, demonstrations to demonstrate their word. In this case, it was from God to Jeremiah, and he said, go and buy a linen belt, go and bury it. And then sometime later, he was asked to go back and get it, and it was rotten. And that was God illustrating to Jeremiah, that's what the nation is like. It is rotten. Chapters 14 and 15, a description of the ruin for Judah that's coming. But interestingly, in Jeremiah 14, 11 to 12, he is forbidden from interceding for the nation. So when a nation or an individual gets to that point, it's very serious indeed. God said, don't intercede for them. It's too late. And when I look at the New Testament, when Jesus appeared before King Herod, it said that Jesus said nothing to him. He wouldn't reply to any of his questions. And I think once you got to the point where either, God, Jesus says, I'm not going to talk to you, then that is a serious place to be. So chapter 16 is the chapter where Jeremiah is told not to marry because of God wants to spare him the burden of having to worry about a family. Chapter 17 describes how people worship idols, but Jeremiah is trusting in the Lord. Chapter 18 is another illustration from God to Jeremiah. And he says, go down and look at the potter, watch him at his wheel. He watched the potter take some clay, make something out of it, wasn't happy with it, so squashed it all down again to remold it. And God said, that's what I'm doing with the nation. I'm the potter and I can remold the nation. And in chapter 18, there's a plot to kill Jeremiah. So he was constantly struggling against his enemies wanting to kill him or do bad things to him. Another illustration in chapter 19, God tells Jeremiah, get a clay pot and smash it. So a prophetic picture to the nation that God's going to shatter them. Chapter 20, we've got another one of these heartfelt pleas of Jeremiah to God. He is beaten and put in stocks. Stocks is where your feet and sometimes your hands and your feet are put in wooden holds that where you can't move. And Jeremiah then says in chapter 20, verse 18, why was I ever born? Why do I have to be born to suffer this? This is my life. Chapter 21 is a time when it's getting close to the destruction of Jerusalem. And now when the armies are surrounding Jerusalem, the Babylonian armies, now King Zedekiah pleads with Jeremiah to intercede for the nation. Now he turns to God, but it's too late. So God says to Jeremiah, too late, you're going to be captured. God's going to destroy Jerusalem. It's already a done deal in God's mind. But Jeremiah did say, for the common people, if you surrender to Nebuchadnezzar, your lives will be spared. Chapter 22, God's message to Judah's wicked kings. Remember, it's not chronological, so we're moving from one time zone to another. Chapter 23, prophetic word that God's going to raise up a righteous king, a righteous branch from the line of David. The house of David will be cut down, but a branch will shoot up and will become God's final and permanent king. Chapter 24, another vision. This is a vision of good figs and bad figs. And so the meaning is, the good figs represent the Jews who will be taken alive to Babylon. So God will protect the exiles who go to Babylon. But the bad ones represent the wicked king Zedekiah and those who follow him, like bad fruit. Now, chapter 25 of Jeremiah is an important chapter. Jeremiah says that the Babylonians are going to destroy Jerusalem. And he says that the length of the Babylonian exile, the captivity of the Jews in Babylon, would last 70 years. Now, this is significant. This is Jeremiah 25, 11 to 12. The exile would last 70 years. Now, that's very interesting, because if we go back to Leviticus chapter 26, verses 32 to 35, God had already prophesied this in Leviticus. God had foreseen that the one part of the covenant that the nation would ignore is that every 7 years they were to leave their land fallow, not to plant on it. And God said, I will bless you so much in the 6th year, you'll have more than enough to carry you through the 7th year. So you were to give the land a Sabbath year's rest every 7 years. They failed to do that. And so Leviticus 26:32, God foreseeing, you won't do this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give the land the 70 years that represents the time that you never gave it a Sabbath year. So that's 70 years. When we come to look at Daniel later on was reading that this towards the end of the exile, towards the end of those 70 years, Daniel was still in Babylon. He was reading Jeremiah's prophecy, and he realized that the 70 years was nearly up, so he started to pray for it. And we'll come to that in Daniel. But interestingly, in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, we see the decree of King Cyrus to allow the Jews to return and rebuild the temple. So that was 636 BC. So the beginning of the exile started in 606 BC. It was 536 that the decree went out to rebuild, that the exiles could go back home and rebuild their Jerusalem. So it was exactly 70 years. And also, Jeremiah says in chapter 25 that after 70 years, Babylon itself will be overthrown. And again, that took place. So shortly we come to chapters 50 and 51, where he goes into a great deal of detail about that, which is very, very interesting. Chapter 26, Jeremiah preaches that the temple will be destroyed, and he narrowly escapes death once more. Jeremiah 27, he says to the people, don't believe the false prophets who are saying Babylon will not conquer them. And he did another illustration where he put a yoke on his neck, the yokes for the animals, put it on his neck, and as a graphic illustration to say, submit to the yoke of Babylon now to avoid what God is going to do. Chapter 28, another prophet, Hananiah, opposes and contradicts Jeremiah, prophesies falsely in God's name, and then that prophet suddenly dies. That should have been a pretty graphic illustration to the people. Chapter 29, another important chapter where Jeremiah writes his letter to the Jewish exiles, where he tells them to settle down because they're going to be there. The exile is going to last for 70 years. So he's telling them to settle down and prosper in the nation. And of course, we have that famous words of Jeremiah that are often quoted, where he writes to the exiles in Babylon and says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord." So that's a well-known passage there. But the context is, it's written to the exiles in Babylon saying, settle down, pray for the peace of the city, because that will benefit you. And later, I'm going to revisit you to bring you back. And then 31, which we've already looked at, is a very important chapter as well, where we've got the new covenant that will replace the old covenant. So the prophetic word of the new covenant is going to replace the old one. And it will be written on people's hearts. That will be the difference. Chapter 32, Jeremiah is told to buy some land. Now remember, the exile is coming. They're all going to be sent into exile. But Jeremiah is told to buy some land in the presence of witnesses, because this is a prophetic illustration that after the exile, the land will be bought and sold again. So Jeremiah never got to benefit from that land, but he bought it as a prophetic illustration of what God was going to do after the exile. Chapter 23, more words about the future of Jerusalem. God will restore the prosperity of Jerusalem and of the land, and he will forgive the nation. And again, the prophetic word, he's going to rise up a righteous king from the line of David, who will sit on the throne of David forever. Jesus, of course. Chapter 34, Zedekiah the king is warned to release Hebrew slaves in accordance with the law of Moses. A Hebrew was only to be used as a slave if he got himself bankrupt for whatever reason for 6 years, and then he had to be released and be given wealth to take with him. That wasn't happening. Another way the covenant was being broken. Jeremiah 35, God tells Jeremiah to notice a clan called the Rechabites. Their ancestors had made a vow that clan would be teetotal. They would never drink wine. And so God tells Jeremiah, offer them wine and see what happens. So he offered them wine, and they said, no, we can't, because we are keeping a clan covenant. And God is saying that's what the nation should be doing. Be faithful to the covenant that God had made. Chapter 36 then is the chapter where the wicked king Jehoiakim is burning Jeremiah's scrolls. Chapter 37, Jeremiah is imprisoned under King Zedekiah now. And King Zedekiah is asking for Jeremiah's prayers as the Babylonians get ever closer to conquer them. What a difficult life Jeremiah had. Chapter 39 is a historical description of the fall of Jerusalem. So it explains just in a narrative form how Babylon takes the nation, takes the city, and takes the nation into exile. And then chapters 40 to 43, again, historical accounts of what happens to the few Jews that remain behind. So although the majority of the Jews were taken exile, the poorest were left behind to look after the land. And then at a later stage, other Gentile nations were brought in. We'll look at this when we come to Ezra. They intermarry, and amongst other things, the Samaritans come into being. But we'll come to that another time. So Jeremiah is spared, and Nebuchadnezzar appoints a man called Gedaliah to govern the nation of Judah, what's left of it. But he's assassinated, and the remnants flee to Egypt, contrary to Jeremiah's instructions. Don't go to Egypt, but they do. So Jeremiah is forcibly taken to Egypt with them against his will. Chapter 44, the reason for Judah's judgment, idolatry, worshipping other gods. Chapter 45, just a short chapter, 5 verses, which is directly spoken about Baruch, Jeremiah's faithful scribe. God promises, don't worry, Baruch, your life will be spared in the coming disaster. And then chapters 46 to 49, we've got prophecies against surrounding nations. So chapter 46 against Egypt, 47 against the Philistines, 48 against Moab, and 49 against Ammon. And then as we just come to the end of the book, chapter 50 and 51, chapters 50 and 51, we've got specific detailed prophecies about the fall of Babylon. So let's look at this because it's very, very encouraging and interesting. So both Jeremiah and Isaiah made detailed predictions about the fall of Babylon. So Isaiah was prophesying earlier, 740 to 701 BC, and now Jeremiah prophesied at this time. Babylon was overthrown in 539 BC, 70 years that have been prophesied. So here are the combined prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah in detail. So just listen to this list and then we'll see what actually happened because it's fascinating. So Isaiah 13:19, Babylon will become like Sodom and Gomorrah. In other words, completely wiped off the map. Isaiah 13:20, it would never be inhabited through the generations. Isaiah 13:20, no Arab would pitch his tent there. Isaiah 13:21, desert creatures would live in the ruins. Isaiah 13:22, it was going to happen soon. Isaiah 14:23, it would become a swampland. Jeremiah 50:13, Babylon will become a wasteland. Chapter 50, 39 to 40, inhabited only by animals. Jeremiah 51:11, the city would be overthrown by the Medes. 51:26, it would remain a desolate city. Jeremiah 51:32, the river crossings would be seized, and then the waters would dry up. Jeremiah 50:38, and it would happen during a drunken feast. Jeremiah 51:39 to 40, and it would happen at the end of the 70 years after the beginning of the exile. So Jeremiah 25:11 to 14. Now those were very detailed, specific prophecies. So let's look at what happened. So Babylon itself then was a very large and prosperous city. It was built on the river Euphrates. And so under King Nebuchadnezzar, it reached its fame, seeing that in the book of Daniel. So some details about the city. It had a circumference of 56 miles, huge. It was protected by a double wall all the way around. The outer wall was 311 feet high and 87 feet wide, so massive protection. It contained 56 watchtowers, each 100 feet higher than the outer walls, so well protected with observers. It contained 100 gates, each of which were made of solid brass. It was surrounded by a 30-foot moat, 30-foot wide moat, so built on the river Euphrates, which formed part of the protection on one side, and a large marshland on the other protected it. So this city was so vast and so seemingly impregnable that when you think of the prophecies that said it was going to vanish, it would seem remarkable. It could not be overcome in battle. So what actually happened then, and the fulfillment of the prophecies? Well, two nations got together, King Cyrus of the Medes, together with the Persians. They came together to attack the city. And what they did is they diverted the course of the river which ran underneath the city walls. I think they had some help from insiders. And so on 13th of October, 539 BC, during a drunken feast, because the people inside thought, well, we're totally safe, Darius the Mede entered through that way and totally surprised them with his army and defeated them. Now, Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 to 30, actually describes that moment when King Belshazzar was having his feast. Remember, we'll come to it, the writing on the wall, and that was the last day. That was when the Medes and the Persians took over. So the city was totally plundered and it fell into complete decay, and it became too costly to rebuild, so it was just left deserted. And what happened is that the desert took over, and so it eventually got buried under the desert. It became a place inhabited by wild animals, partly covered by water, and the area below was a swampland. And it vanished from sight, exactly as the prophet said. And for 2,500 years, nobody knew where that city was until at the beginning of the 19th century, some archaeologists found it and discovered it. So remarkably detailed prophecies came to be. So chapter 52, a description then of the historic fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, and the destruction of the temple and the exile of the Jews. And then it concludes with the new king of Babylon, Evil-Merodach, who showed kindness to King Jehoiachin, who'd been imprisoned in Babylon for 37 years. So that comes to the end of the book of Jeremiah, but Jeremiah wrote one more book, which is the book of Lamentations that we'll look at next time.